Hi, Alan Hadley with My Photo Networks. Thanks for joining me for this next video tutorial. Today, we're going to be focusing on a couple of different elements. The first thing is we're going to be shooting with a very shallow depth of field, 2.8 to 5.6. The second thing is we're only going to use a long focal length lens, 80 to 200 millimeter, which most of the images that I'm going to illustrate in this video tutorial were shot at 200 millimeter. The third thing that we're going to illustrate is that the type of day or the quality of light that we're shooting in. Everything that was shot in this video tutorial was done on a cloudy, windy, misting rain day. It was very overcast and it was very windy, and what we were focusing on was specific subject matter using a long focal length lens. One of the beauties of shooting with a shallow depth of field coupled with a long focal length lens is that you can focus specifically on your subject and isolate that subject from the background. So, with that said, let's get started.
In this first image, let's take a look at how specific using a long focal length lens really is. When we're shooting with a 200 millimeter lens on this fence post with these yellow leaves actually coming up above it, what I wanted to do is to isolate those leaves from the background. Now, there's a couple of different ways to actually do this. First, I could have shot straight onto it, but I chose to shoot from an angle, basically reducing our depth of field even more. We were shooting at 2.8, so our image circle is extremely small, as you can see where the bolts are on the wood itself, into the actual leaves. That's our image circle. Everything else is out of focus. That is specifically created by not only the f-stop that we're using, but the focal length of the lens that we're shooting with. Now, you can simulate this same effect by using a shorter focal length lens, say a 55 millimeter or a 60 millimeter, whatever you might have, simply by choosing the correct distance from the lens to the subject and the f-stop that you're using. So by isolating that background through using a small f-stop, 2.8, 3.2, 3.5, what we're doing is literally making this subject pop off the background. And in this particular situation, that is exactly what we wanted to do. Okay, in this particular example, what we did is choose a pretty extreme angle to shoot this bridge. What I started out doing when I found this bridge was actually looking at how long the bridge was. So that kind of determined the perspective that I was going to actually shoot this image from. And remember, perspective, when utilizing this technique, is very important because the sharper the angle, the less depth of field that you're going to have across your entire image. So as you'll notice in this image, we have a very shallow depth of field in the foreground, and we have a very shallow depth of field in the background. So our image circle is literally right in the middle of the image. Now, that's what I was actually focusing on. This particular image was shot at 2.8 at 1/1250th of a second. Now, this is in the middle of the day. It's a cloudy, overcast day. So we have some decent light and without hard shadows. So what I wanted to focus on is the romantic aspect of this particular scenario. I wanted to show that good light that was falling onto the bridge, but I also wanted to be able to isolate parts of the bridge through my f-stop and the focal length that I was using. What I did in post-processing was simply add a soft focus filter to it to take the effect a little further. In this next example, we've actually shot these yellow leaves on a tree limb that's overhanging some water. Now, one of the key aspects to creating this effect is what's behind the subject. That's called the circles of confusion. Whenever you use a long focal length lens and you're shooting something very close and you're using a shallow depth of field like 2.8, what it's going to do is actually drop that background completely out. Something that's distracting or something that's too dark or too bright will actually take away from the image. So when you're framing up an image like this and you're using this technique, pay attention to what's behind the image or behind what you're actually shooting, so that it plays with the image itself and gives an interesting overall background for the image to sit on. In this next image, what we've done is actually choose the perspective that allows us to stack our image. Now, what does stack your image mean? Well, when you're using a long focal length lens, what will happen is that everything that's in the front closest to the lens and the furthest away actually compresses because of the focal length that you're using. So in normal circumstances or under certain conditions, you might want to use a deeper f-stop, say f16, f22, so that everything's in focus. In this particular scenario, what I wanted to accomplish is to have something in the foreground that was out of focus, which gives us a sense of depth, but yet make it appear that the sage grass that's in front of the barn was actually right against the barn, when in reality it wasn't. There was actually about 15 feet between the actual sage and the barn itself. So what that focal length and perspective did for us is stack that image so that it appears that it's actually closer together. Our depth of field gave us a nice soft foreground, which gives us a sense of depth. Okay, in this next image, what I wanted to accomplish is the effect of looking into, say, like a tunnel or looking down this pathway. I wanted everything as I traveled through this pathway to appear soft and out of focus around the edges, but yet focusing sharply on the trees that are in the background. To be able to do that, we had to couple not only our f-stop at 2.8, but our shutter speed at 1/2500th of a second and our focal length at 200 millimeter. To be able to do this and make it look this way, we had to use all three of those elements to be able to create what you're looking at in this image. Now, in certain situations, this might be a sidewalk, it might be a tunnel, it might be some flowers that you're focusing on, but it's creating this depth perception that's allowing the viewer to actually step into the photograph and give them the feeling that they're looking into something. That's the whole point of this particular technique, is to be able to manipulate through the use of f-stop and focal length the actual look and feel of the image. This is our last image of this tutorial. I think you have a good idea of how to use this technique. What I encourage you to do is get your camera, get a long focal length lens, and go out and play with this particular technique. I think you'll find in certain situations this is a tool that you can use just about any time that you want to create this effect. So with that said, that brings us to the end of this tutorial, and I look forward to our next.